Hey everybody, welcome back to Channel Talks. I'm your host Nick Verikios, and I was reminded recently, and this surprised me, that the Channel Talks podcast has been going on now for 3.5 years. But what was really interesting is my first interview was with Scott Frew, and my second interview was with Jay McBain, who are the two gentlemen that I'm speaking to today. But what it did do, in earnest, is make me reflect on the many messages that have been coming from so many esteemed guests. I know I'm going to forget a few, but we do the ecosystem. So from the analysts and commentators community, of course, Jay McBain, Julian Lee, Alan Adler, James Henderson, Jack Johnson. Also the vendor community. We've been lucky to have Nick Mehta, Carl Sutherland, of course, the great Izips, Wendy Sturgis, who was amazing, Doug Cavanis, and Rennie Gikwelwi, who was our first vendor. And of course, the all-important distributor reseller in the MSP community, and that's included Matthias Now, Dan Tomaszewski, big names representing important channel organizations and channel influencers. Yes, that makes me feel blessed and honored, but my feelings aren't that important. What is important is the message, and I've tried real hard to essentialize, after listening to most of them over the past month, to just essentialize what the message is. And a common theme is always about using automation tools, not particularly anyone in isolation, hint vendors, but to transform their digital journey, meeting their consumer and user requirements by delivering business productivity, business protection, and a good return on their human assets as well as their tech assets while they look for new revenue opportunities. So if I kind of try to bring that down, it summarizes to me as using revenue technology to enhance sales operations. And yes, we have a couple of new names for these things. Sounds simple, right, guys? But it hasn't been the case. So this is what I want to explore with you two today. Of course, I've got Jay McBain, who's currently the head of Canalys Research, and may I also add LinkedIn Influencer of the Year again and again and again. And of course, joining us is Scott Frew, who is the founder and CEO of the multi-award winning, again and again, RevTech and Global Leader iasset. So gentlemen, welcome back.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, look, the need for business to transform digitally hasn't changed. That's definitely the case. And businesses are using their channel partners and their influencer ecosystem, of course, looking for automation, looking for innovation. But that's kind of been the case since I joined the industry about 35 years ago. Still. So the question that I had floating in my mind over the last couple of days is, has the channel failed, or is it still figuring it out while it's evolving on how to do this? Jay, I'm going to throw that to you first, mate.
Well, I think the channel succeeded. This year, businesses and governments will spend $4.7 trillion on tech and telco. It's been the fastest growing industry for a decade, and 73.1% of that will be delivered to, through, and with partners. So the channel has absolutely succeeded in terms of driving this industry forward. And as we're in an economic downturn at the moment, tech was the industry that pulled the world out of recession in 2008 and 2001, and it's going to happen again. And the channel, partners, alliances, and the whole ecosystem is at the tip of the spear that will drive it out of this again.
Yeah, so its relevance is obviously there, and I love that you actually gave the numbers, because the numbers are substantial. And while there's growth, there's also channel growth. And the channel growth sounds like it's faster than the industry growth. Is that fair?
Yeah, so we track the top 1,000 partners financials as best as we can get them. Most of them are 99% of them are private companies. But the ones that are public, that we do get to track to the penny, they are growing faster than their vendors and distributors.
Right.
So, obviously the move into services and finding profitable multipliers connected to the vendors. One of the biggest changes you've seen in the last year or so is the vendors now start to talk, not in margin sense of how much you can make on the deal, but how much you can multiply for every dollar that they sell. Okay. We helped AWS explain a $6.40 multiplier. So if you can go make $2 or $3 for every dollar of consumption in the cloud, and you can do that at 75% margins, this has partners outgrowing their vendors. And so we're seeing that And at the other end of the scale, there's still a third of managed service providers that are losing money or fail every month to be profitable. So there is two sides of the economics of channels.
Okay, that's some serious serious numbers backing a serious trend. Scotty, I want to ask you. I mean, Jay's kind of talked about the critical trends that he's seeing for Channel without me even asking him, which is fantastic. But I want to ask you from the base, or what you see as the most critical trends based on, hey, look, 150 plus vendors being managed on the channel, 2 billion worth of transactions. What's causing that? What does that mean? Is the channel automating? Is it less automating? Is it more? It sounds like it's automating to be able to meet these changes that Jay's talking about, which also, in my mind, includes ridiculously high amounts of growth in transactions as well.
So I see it as two parts. Jay's right insofar as the reseller community is growing. The challenge they're facing is trained resources, because every cyber guy is dragging the smartest people out of the channel to run the security side of things. And everyone's trying to fill in the gaps, for networking and other parts of the business, cloud consumption, whatever it is. So there's this twofold thing going on where you've got this lack of trained resources out there to easily get to, or capital, but also the growing business. And I mean, that's, to Jay's point, when we have any sort of crisis, whether it's the dot bomb or the GFC or whatever it is, IT's in the perfect spot because people are looking to change, and it's the customers are looking to change, the partners are looking to change, the vendors have to change. So this whole delivery piece then talks, the sweet spot is automation, which is where we are at. And I quite often, it's actually interesting from Jay's point of view that in the last year alone, we've had more service providers, VARs or resellers, depending on the country you're in, come to us to engage rather than, say, vendors or distributors. So there's this mad rush to automate their processes because they've got their cloud consumption piece and there's not a lot of margin on that, so they need to automate it and get it into their ERP and out the other side quickly. And then they need to run the product life cycles. We've got one Asian reseller at the moment that they haven't been tracking the hardware appliances that they give the customer. So if they run out of a renewal on a security device, it leaves the customer potentially exposed. So there's a lot of interrelated pieces in the service provider market they haven't had to deal with that they now have to deal with. And you can't use people to do it. You need to automate that process.
So they're automating critical components in their revenue operations, right? Or RevOps. There's a word, RevOps, that both of you can start to talk. So maybe later on I'll get you both to define RevOps and RevTech, because I hear it every day, on the hour, every hour. But critically, I think what I also believe is that automation based on the changes. Jay, I want to see if this collaborates with your research. They're also unlocking new opportunities in around customer lifetime value. Does that collaborate with what you see?
Yeah, I mean, there's some very big trends going on. First and foremost, every company on the planet across 27 industries has committed into a subscription consumption model, because that's what their shareholders and that's what Wall Street in the US wants them to do. That changes, not only the economics of how you work with customers, over their journey, over their lifetime, but the economics of partner change in that fact as well. When the point of sale becomes the first 30 days with the customer, we're starting to see in the last 18 months how that impacts the programs and the processes and obviously the underlying financial mechanisms that run our industry. So that's a business model change. Secondly, you've got a demographic shift where in 4 quarters, you've got now a millennial aged buyer that is both the majority of buyers and majority of budget. So that's changing psychology, behaviors, and the customer journey itself as consumer behaviors start to merge into business behaviors and how that changes and leads to a RevOps conversation. You've got, obviously, every company you've heard in every industry is becoming more of a tech company, which is driven on partnerships. You've got all kinds of changes that are happening both within business and within customers that I think is changing generationally, making some, big shifts in the way the world works. And that's an opportunity, for all of us to think through the operational and automation side of it.
Okay, so am I hearing you right? The trend is now no longer just about net new logos. It's net revenue retention. How much have I gained? Less how much have I lost? Churn, because I haven't been looking after the current installed base. And that is the new super regime as opposed to just net new logos. So therefore, that means there is an absolute specific priority shift among channel executives, or has to be. Is that fair? And if it is fair, is it happening, Scott? Are you hearing this more and more?
I think it's like the adoption curve. You've got early adopters, the middle, and then the late adopters. And there are a lot of companies that are being dragged along by the nose effectively to get into this, not because they want to, because they have to. And that is sort of that middle part of the curve. Actually, Jay, I wanted to ask you a question on that millennial buyer piece. Do you also see a corresponding increase in millennial sellers?
What is generational? So you've got all of them increasing. The fact of the matter is, it's interesting because it's all coming in kind of at the same time.
Yep.
And some of the behaviors in the whole industry, I mentioned the $5 trillion industry. We've had a millennial buyer now for about 5 years in SaaS. So if you took a $200 billion subset of the entire industry and watched how people bought Salesforce, ServiceNow, Workday, Marketo, NetSuite, HubSpot, we've been facing off against this buyer for quite a while.
Yep.
And understanding what behavioral changes in the buying cycle, what psychology driven changes, the journey itself, the 28 moments that the average buyer spends before making a vendor selection, and what every 30 days looks like after the initial transaction, for that customer for life. We're understanding that, for example, it's now an integration first buyer in the last 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely.
It shocked everyone when Apple got up in their keynote. Tim Cook got up in his keynote and said 79% of people won't buy a car today unless it has Apple CarPlay. He left out the Android Auto part of it.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, for 120 years, 63 major manufacturers of cars and 365 brands of cars have competed in a certain way. Now you're going to lose 4/5 of your customers if you don't have the right technology alliance partnership. And so that behavioral change is coming into how people buy services, how they buy hardware, how they buy software. Those 28 moments that lead up to that point of purchase, and now how integrations are the number one way they buy. And for the first time, they'll buy a product that is 80% as good as the competitor if it works better in their sandbox.
Right.
And so all these things happen at once, but it's a way to understand this new buyer and how to serve them, in a different way.
When you say new buyer, same buyer, new needs.
No, new buyer, new demographic buyer that's getting older and now in a decision-making, budget-holding mode.
Okay.
That has a completely different psychology and set of behaviors.
Can an old buyer transition?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no binary A or B type of buyer. Everybody's on a scale and a certain threshold. But what we had been predicting for kind of 5 years, and just looking at demographics around the world, it is now starting to set into the marketing and the selling and the customer success at how you engage, to sell your product, whichever product, whichever industry you happen to be in. So those things are all happening now. But in the old world, it's sat pretty much as silos. So you talk about automation or RevOps. In the old world, you have 11,039 marketing ISVs. So if you go look at Scott Brinker's MarTech AdTech stack, marketing ops are pulling together 11,000 SaaS products. In the sales world, closing the deal and doing the transaction around the CRM, there's about 5,000 ISVs. In the channel world, there's 233. In the customer success world now, there's a couple thousand. But in total RevOps, it's marketing, it's selling, it's customer success, it's the underlying partners, it's the tech alliances and all the strategic and business alliances. You pull all that together in a kind of a go-to-market.
Mm-hmm.
You're dealing with 25 to 30,000 software products that need to be integrated,
Right.
and need to be automated, and now need to dump data into a single data lake, data warehouse that can be trained on large language models and can be tuned to the future of generation AI, which is something we did, generative AI, which is something we didn't mention on the last time we talked.
Yep.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
in the last year.
Yeah, we certainly will, because Scott can't help himself. So we'll definitely go there. But before we go on to these things, you touched on something, Jay, that's really important to me, because I hate buzzwords and when they become boring. So I've been using the term the live ecosystem, and what I'm referring to is you take away the fluff and you start to look at it, Jay, from your perspective. That live ecosystem is based on your as a service technology stack, what I call the islands in the stream, or the very connected islands that become, a live ecosystem rather than just separate components that don't talk to each other. I'm going to ask you to talk to me about, or to talk to my audience about what all that means, what it is, what is the Canalys Channel Ecosystem landscape, the one that's back behind you that I look at every bloody day, and how does the channel benefit from that? But then, Scott, I'm going to ask you a different way of asking that. So, Jay, tell us about that, why it's important, how it's working, and is it a live ecosystem?
Yeah, let's oversimplify, get rid of a little bit of jargon first. McKinsey, who is consulting with all of the biggest Fortune companies, they have the trust and ear of the board, trust of the CEO. They came out and said the average buyer today, the average B2B buyer, has 7 people they trust, 7 companies, 7 people wrapped around. It's a team sport. So the whole point of ecosystem is all you're doing is inspecting the 7 trusted people that are, sit around your customer. And when you start expanding the conversation to that level, you'll find out that 6 or more of those 7 people are not resellers, not retailers, not agents, not brokers. They never collect the customer's money on behalf of a vendor, but they're adding other value. The customer's spending money with them for other things. So there's this whole life cycle. In those 28 moments before you make a decision, I need to configure and price and quote. I need to learn more, and I need to do the competitive analysis. I need the deeper consulting. I need the design, the architecture work. Like, there's so much that goes into it that I can sell as services. But the people that are selling those services, if they don't collect the customer's money, we've only spent the last 43 years at that point of transaction measuring that moment. Whereas if you start measuring, monitoring, and managing the other moments that lead up to the sale, you get some ridiculously powerful data to say how a sale actually happens.
Yes.
And if you can start to influence the 7 people that wrap around each one of your customer prospects, that's the ecosystem. That's the points of influence, the kind of the intersection of influence that your customer goes through. If at least one of those people mention your name, and at better, if the majority of those people say your name in a positive way, you're probably going to win the deal.
Right.
So for anyone who's asked, for example, why Microsoft Azure has outgrown AWS for 17 straight quarters,
right,
without having a better product, the measurement we look at is those 7 people surrounding that hyperscale multi-cloud buyer. How many of those 7 people are talking about Microsoft versus AWS versus Google versus other? And how does that happen? An army of partnerships that are doing non-transactional behaviors and activities that lead to, outgrowing a much larger, much more powerful competitor without product, price, promotional, or place differences.
That to me is fascinating because I agree, and you can see all those 28 moments. You can see them, and the point you made was several are non-transactional, but several are, which means that the automation side of it has to come into play as well. Otherwise, these gazillion transactions don't happen. And Scott, I'm throwing this back to you because several analysts have said, and I'm not trying not to embarrass you here, but that iasset is the only ecosystem CPQ out there, and it democratizes the ecosystem, meaning that it's all got to come together somehow. And I want to ask you what Jay's talking about in the actual binding transactional side of those 28 moments, which is at least 6 or 7 that we see. Um, how does that all come together practically? And I'm thinking in terms of the channel gateway APIs. Can you talk about that, how all that works?
Sure. So if you take it a step back, in the entire channel mix, what we've been trying to do for 15 years, which is only really starting to happen, is to make sure that all of the data across the channel is accurate. Because at the moment, not only do you have silos within vendors, silos within distributors, and silos within resellers or service providers, you have the silos separate to each of them.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're trying to do is bring those all together. So the channel gateway API set is like a channel iPaaS. Now, I don't like to use iPaaS, but it quickly positions it, if you like. The reason I don't like iPaaS is because everyone tells me I should talk to their iPaaS because then I can talk to a bunch of different things with one API. But there's like 1,000 iPaaSes out there that I need to talk to. So really what we're trying to do is connect all those dots. And if you look at some of our customers that have someone else related to the deal, it may not be an influencer, it may be some sort of technology partner. For the first time, because those two data sets are being tracked, you can actually see the combined transaction. So, there are certain partnerships where switching technology works with storage technology, works with the operating system. You can combine those all, not necessarily giving away the crown jewels to each one of the party or to one of the parties, but actually have their data set for each part of that set and share the common overlap and channels so that people can be remunerated. There's partnership dollars out there where transactions are closed using other technologies. So the channel API, channel gateway API is all about connecting all the dots together, but without creating a single source of truth, because everyone talks about a single source of truth, but in reality, you need multiple sources of truth. Your ERP still needs to be the source of truth for financial transactions. The ITSM still has to be the source of truth for entitlement records, for support, and all the rest of it. The CRM for opportunities before they get into a hard transactional sort of area. But to take your RevOps point, the way I see RevOps is very simple. Rev technology or revenue technology like us squeezes our way in between all those three systems and connects them all together and then connects the channel to it. So you end up with this super clean data set, which you can then plug your AI into because you've actually got accurate data the AI can make decisions over, rather than there's a lot of rubbish data sitting out in different silos.
Well, we see that live now, gents. I think what you're both doing is agreeing with this importance of an integrated, either or through automation or through some kind of relationship, human relationship, to make those moments turn into a sale. But in agreeing, there's also a lot of things that are happening at the moment that are surprising and shocking some people. You guys have made me move to another area here that I didn't expect to go to, but I need to because I want continuity in what you're talking about. I'm getting a lot of distress feedback from questions around, hyper marketplaces, hyperscalers, hyper marketplace, whatever you want. You know what I'm talking about: the Amazon AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle Cloud, all those marketplaces. And MSPs are starting to rethink their position in all this, as I was kind of like a service provider. Now I'm becoming a prime contractor, but almost less of a prime contractor. I'm going back to my roots of being a reseller and back to my roots of procurement services, because I just can't compete against these hyperscalers, which kind of was what I was selling when I was building an MSP. Is that just a small number of people talking to me complaining, or is this a trend? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll say, Jay, for the first part. I see it actually out there in the field is changing. When everyone moved to cloud, it was like when the industry went outsourcing and then they dragged it back to task sourcing. You're seeing this shift coming back to sometimes on-prem processing or selective tasks being sent to different areas for processing. So I see that coming back, and it's the old school integration piece, right? You need a front end person or people to connect all those dots together. If you're just throwing it all at AWS or one of the other marketplaces, what value are you effectively adding? You're a billing blip in the middle of it. So I see it slightly differently in that you have to integrate what you're pulling out of these marketplaces to other areas inside the tech stack.
How closely, Jay, in terms of those 28 moments, do the professional or relationship based connections around all those islands has to also somehow integrate into the transactional points that are connected by APIs and making a sale happen? And I'm only asking because it has to be profitable as well. So it has to be, it has to be worthwhile doing it. I'm asking specifically because we're seeing significant diversifying of routes to market. How do those two things come together?
Yeah, so a lot here, but marketplaces are growing at 86% compounded. We are now seeing vendors like last week, CrowdStrike, a security company, just reported they've sold now $1 billion through AWS with a B, where we predicted AWS would be a top 10 distributor by next year, joining the likes of TD SYNNEX and Ingram. And I actually think they're going to beat our prediction. I think they are now. I think they've reached the top 10 already. So here is a route to market that's growing. Again, go back to our new buyer. It's a team sport. They have 7 people that surround them. The average hyperscaler deal, multi-cloud deal, has 7 layers to it. So people are adding security, they're adding generative AI, they're adding analytics, they're adding it to every deal. The average deal in SaaS today, Salesforce, ServiceNow, Workday, is 7 layers on the marketplace. The average security deal today is 7 layers to get to zero trust. So 7, you get a lot of 7s.
Yeah.
And 7 partners that surround them. So it's a lucky number 7 today and growing. But it's a team sport. And the way procurement is changing, the way, from product-led growth to how products are, kind of landed and expanded and everything else, it serves this new digital younger buyer in terms of marketplaces. Something important happened, it's now a couple of years ago, that set the course for where we are. In the consumer world, we know when we go out to a restaurant or we buy something and we swipe our credit card, that the vendor spends 3% or close to 3% in terms of that transactional fee. That's the cost of collecting money. A whole network of companies fronted by Visa and MasterCard take a few pennies out of that 3%, and that's how the world works on the consumer side. Microsoft came out in the B2B space and took their marketplace fees from 20% down to 3%. Google was forced to follow, AWS followed, everybody's kind of following. We now know in B2B and B2C, which the new buyer doesn't really make any distinguished difference between, that the actual economic value of collecting a customer's money, sitting on net.30 and sending out BIF to break their knees when they don't pay, and all of the assumed risk of within that is 3%. So you're telling a community of resellers, for example, that started their businesses August 12th, 1981, when they opened up their first IBM dealership. They're telling, back then they were at 40% margin, and then 30, and then 20, and then they had to build out services to keep the lights on, then 10. But what you're telling people now is the cost of exchanging money and everything in between it is 3. And that has to be shared between the distributor and the reseller. So other things, which you gave away for free, you weren't just collecting 40 points of margin or 30 points of margin. You gave away the consulting, you gave away the design, architecture, implementation, integration, hundreds of services you did for free to collect money at the point of sale, which is the economic value of partnering. Now, by this market becoming more transparent and having a smarter buyer that knows the cost of moving their money over for products and services is 3%, they're now understanding the multiplier to that, which is the cost of these hundreds of services that aren't provided for free anymore. That's what's changing, is just how these things are getting separated in front of a new, more engaged and obviously more transparent sales and marketing process than it ever was.
Okay, so is that merchant of record moving away from the service provider, and is it now becoming more a direct responsibility from the tech provider, if you like? The tech provider being the creator and the service provider being the deliverer. That's my definition.
To a vendor, it actually doesn't matter anymore how money changes hands, and nor should it. So, for the vendors that have been fighting for years and years and years to be 100% channel, what they were doing is giving up the market TAM that sold direct. And what they were doing now is giving up a bigger market TAM and a faster growing market TAM that's growing through marketplaces. If you go back to that buyer and say, if you sell direct, there's a 3% cost in SG&A to have people collecting the bills and AR department and everything else, which is the same 3% cost if they buy it through a marketplace, which is now basically the same 3% cost that you have to pay out in margin in your gross to nets if it goes indirectly. But in the end, to go after 100% of your market TAM, whether you sell software, lawn tractors, toothbrushes, to go after 100% of your market TAM, you should not care how money changes hands. You should let the buyer decide that and provide the least friction way possible for them to go do that.
Okay, so Scott, I'm going to challenge that. I'm going to challenge that, and the reason why I'm going to challenge that, and I need you to help me so we can gang up on Jay in this. I agree that the vendor doesn't care, but what does become really important is the information back. So the data back, the transactional data back. So someone's going to own that, to know about it, to be able to perform the execution of vendor programs for customer lifetime value, asset lifetime value, and the all-important, one of your predictions for this year, the sustainability bit. What do you do after you get rid of it? Or when it goes end of life. So, Scott, is Jay right to the extent that that's what's happening, but what he's talking about is bad in terms of how data is being collected to be able to execute on vendor programs?
Well, because I like Jay and he's a Canadian, another Commonwealth, guy, I don't like to upset him and disagree too hard. I agree with fundamentally the fact that whoever the customer is going to transact through whichever mechanism it is that makes it easy for them, and the vendor doesn't care about that. They've never really cared about that. I think what you're alluding to is there is value to be gained by being the right type of channel for the vendor to get feedback for the product life cycles, the install base tracking, and now with ESG. I was on a call with a huge vendor in North America about tracking carbon offsets on every product, but not only just tracking the offset, making that available to all the downstream channel and the end user so that they know they're meeting their particular ESG requirements. So the data bit is critical, but I see that as a value add potentially through the channel to rip it off, a marketplace potentially who aren't going to feed that data back to the vendor. So again, it's levels of value that people can provide. And we've got service providers that are tracking all of these assets in a customer and charging for it. So to Jay's point about it might have been 3% to transact the product, but they're pulling another 2 or 3% every year on just managing the asset base that's sitting inside the customer. So the customer doesn't have to worry about it. And one of my oldest, when I started in distribution, my oldest thing was, if you take pain or heat from someone, they'll pay you for it.
I kind of feel like you both ganged up on me just then. that didn't go according to plan. But can we agree? Can we agree that the route to market will change a lot, but the information flow to allow for customer lifetime value and asset lifetime value needs to be strict and automated and determined and accurate, and has to be a program that the vendor has to own?
Yeah, I would say that the smarter buyer has forced this industry to turn inside out. I made the comment about August the 12th, 1981. I spent 17 years to start my career selling laptops, selling desktops. So, I was kind of in that.
Jay said 17, not 70. It sounded like
17, 17 years. I'm not that old yet. But I will say that the one thing we hid from customers was the total cost of ownership.
Right.
Running a client server environment was ridiculously expensive and inefficient. And it was so inefficient that $488 billion industry called managed services was created because of it, to solve for that problem. Customers spend $500 billion, to kind of manage all these IT environments they have. And now 335,000 partners out there have at least one managed contract around the world. So talk about a inside-out industry where the TCO was hidden, but the pain was felt. Back to your comments. So now it's the other way around. The cloud companies are actually publishing their TCO. And Microsoft has $7.63, AWS $6.40, Salesforce $6.19. I can rip through them all. But the fact is they're telling the channel what customers either need to insource or outsource. So if a customer decides to outsource 100% of the purchase of technology and all of the other consulting, design, implementation, integration, hundreds of other services, including the asset management, including the sustainability and the carbon footprint, all the hundreds of things, it's going to cost you, that multiplier on top of the deal. So you consume $100,000 of cloud services, and it costs you $700,000.
Yeah,
that's it. So now the industry's inside out, and you've now told partners what the customer ought to be spending if they choose to insource or outsource that. And now it helps partners because they may either be undercharging for that, or in the case of history, they give it away for free.
Yeah.
Nothing is free anymore in an inside-out, transparent world. And customers should know, that $700,000 is the budget. If you can insource half of it, great, but still you need to spend $350,000.
Mm-hmm.
That's $100,000 with the product and $250,000 in services before, during, and after the transaction for the first 3 years. So that's it. That's now full information, and a buyer that is curious and a buyer that is obsessed over getting, and that's why they spend their first 28 moments getting smart, because they want to turn over every stone. And they want this, and this is where RevOps and this is where automation comes in. The more we recognize and monitor and measure and manage these moments, these customer moments, the more value we can deliver to them, and the more we can help our partners go find that high revenue, high profit opportunity, and leave that transactional piece as really important, but now, there's no mystery to how that takes place.
Scott, you're agreeing a lot with Jay here, so I'm defeated. But I want to know why you're agreeing, but I also want to know why the every time you talk to, because you've told me this, every time you talk to a vendor, the first thing they say to you is, we just don't even know where the transactions are. We don't even know where the data is. How are we going to get to where Jay's talking? Because I agree with Jay, by the way. I completely agree with him.
So ultimately, it's a battle with IT, because IT are the only ones that can be the central point for a lot of this data, or these data silos. Although they might be owned by different businesses and there might be some gatekeepers around them that you've got to break through. IT is critical for this. And, you know, often with SaaS companies, and I'm sure Jay's seen this before, with SaaS companies are regarded as shadow IT. IT guys don't really like us because we might be replacing resources that they could potentially employ. But in reality, those data sets are either they exist. I mean, the most basic one's an ERP set. I mean, that's got financial information, you know, your sales history. You might have some point of sale data in there. That is the most basic set you need to get to. And if you can get to that and start adding the enhanced point of sale data around it, then you start to get the pictures we're talking about. Then you connect it to support systems or even dial home systems. Now you're adding even more data richness to each record or each transaction, each channel transaction, each customer transaction. So that, and again, we get back to AI. AI cannot make assumptions on bad data. So if anyone sitting here listening to this, it doesn't matter whether you're a vendor, distributor, or reseller, if you don't have that data piece, that foundational data piece sitting there in your business that connects your ecosystem together, you are going to struggle with AI. It doesn't matter which way you deploy it.
Yeah. If the artificial side of it is bad, the intelligence is going to be bad.
Well, I mean, to give an example, I asked ChatGPT to write me a fairly complex formula for Excel just because I was being lazy, and it was wrong. I could tell it was wrong almost straight away, right? I had to go in and manually edit it. So again, the underlying data is going to make or break your business if AI is going to be a critical part.
One of my pet things at the moment, it's just kind of like, I wasn't going to ask this, but you guys are walking into it. Vendors are creating channel programs, incredible channel programs around their asset lifetime value, customer lifetime value. That's what they're looking for, and they're starting to recognise that their existing customers are equally important, if not more important, as the prospects that they're trying to bring in. And actually, Jay, I'm trying to get Michelle on to talk about this because she's an incredible expert at this. So I think hopefully that'll happen very soon. But what I'm also seeing, and this is what I wanted to ask you guys, and I will absolutely ask Michelle if I get her on the show, is the program is there, but are vendors? I think absolutely not. Are vendors in the main giving their channel partners, distributors and resellers, the ability to execute on those programs profitably? Who wants to go first?
I can go first and let Scott carry it home. But I mean, the major change in the last year and a half has been point systems. And the point systems is recognizing that partner moments outside of the transaction carry value. If you can reliably measure a moment and you can quantify that moment up against the point of sale, somebody reads an ebook and they have a 3x better chance of buying my product. There's a point that I want to go back to the person who wrote that ebook and say, here's $5,000. Can you write 3 more?
Yeah.
As you measure the 3 new ebooks, and if it stays on that 3-time multiplier, you're going to come back with $10,000. You're going to keep coming back with money as long as you don't hit a threshold of diminishing returns.
Yeah.
You're going to be running a Super Bowl ad together if it keeps running at that same level. So now break down those 28 moments, but break down every 30 days forever in this elongated customer lifetime value, which is a subscription consumption model. By the way, Wall Street, for the companies that have done this, has an expectation of 108% retention, which is to say every customer you lose, you have to double up a current customer.
Yep.
So companies like a Microsoft, who were first out with a point system, that gave points for the first 28 moments, gave points at the point of transaction. So even if you're one of those 24% of partners who click buy on the Microsoft marketplace, you had your finger on the trigger, but you're not the partner of record. And every 30 days forever, they put 2/3 of all their money post-sale. They were already beating AWS 17 quarters in a row. They didn't need a lot of help in sales and marketing. They put it all in to reach that 108% number. And there's people up in Redmond that think they're one bad iPhone launch away from being the most valuable company on the planet. That's it. That's valuation. And you can talk about Microsoft up there. You can talk about a managed service provider with 8 people. Everyone is after shareholder value and the valuation that every dollar that you earn is worth. More companies, so VMware, HP, all the companies we've been on stage announcing these point systems are putting their points in the part that are going to get them the highest valuation, which is the customer for life. They're taking away money at the point of sale, reducing it to that 3%, but offering up, they're not reducing their gross to nets. They're not saying I could be more profitable if I don't take 30 or 20% margin. If I only take 10, I'm going to be that much more profitable. No, they're keeping their gross to nets, but they're finding ways through distribution, finding ways through marketplaces, private offers and distributor offers. They're finding ways through direct to pay out partners in all of the other activities. This is the different economics of partnering. And now I think 35,000 vendors now have inbound calls into us at Canalys talking about point systems. And how are we going to properly measure and automate and operationalize these moments so they become predictable, quantifiable, and that my CFO and my board trust them?
Yeah, so this is the difficulty. And Scott, I want to know what you think, because for me, the difficulty is vendors aren't doing what you're talking about, starting to, or at least getting there. But my thesis has always been, hey, vendor, I come from a distribution world. Do you realize that no technology lives in isolation? So unless your ability to execute on your program is integrated into many other moments, touch point moments, whether they be another technology or whether so I don't know if a vendor is going to be able to do that. This is where these SaaS platforms come out, the marketing platforms, the technology, all these platforms, the iasset platforms, all that come into play and democratise the process and have to all link in together. I really do want to know what you're seeing, Scott, but I also want Jay to reply before we start to have a little bit of fun before the end of the hour.
So our experience is 8 years ago, we built the point system. The problem that manufacturer had at the time, or OEM or software provider, had at the time was, how do you connect the other partners in this point system? So what and maybe this is why marketplaces arrived when they did, their decision was ultimately, we need to control the entire transaction so we know who to apply the points to. So we built in the whole relationship marketplace, not like a marketplace like an AWS, but you could transact consumption from other vendors on this vendor's portal so that they could get the holistic view of what's going on. I think the challenge at a data level, which is what I'm really all about, is we are struggling to get vendors to capture just the transactional data. Now we're trying to get them to track the points data for unrelated transactional parties. And I think that's a huge opportunity to go wider with a platform like ours. But you've got to find those parties, and how do you motivate them to get into that point system?
What you guys are just talking about right now, to me, is really critical, because everyone's trying to get there. The advice on how to get there, well, there's plenty of it right now here from you two, but is almost difficult to comprehend, because the partnering model is no longer, I tell you what to do and you do it really well, and if you do it really well, I'll give you a gold star and then you get 2 extra points, right? That's not it. That's
or a platinum star. Depends on the program.
That's not it. And Jay, I think you've mentioned this on previous channel talks, that can't be the way to go, and the new way is the way to go. I just feel at least in the conversations I'm having with a lot of vendors, that they can't look outside what they're doing. They almost aren't allowed to look outside what they're doing. They have to do, but some are doing it really well, and starting to open up that way, particularly in the traditional world. And what worries me is the SaaS players are in the best. All those people on that board that you've got behind you, Jay, are in the best position to do it. They don't have a lot of baggage. All right, they're in the best position to do it, but are lacking. And in a big way, I believe that the reason why these valuations are really not that good at the moment for SaaS companies is because they're missing that boat. What do you think?
There's an important piece that we've been kind of circling around to, but we'll finish with this, is that while the future and the trends and everything seems to be pointing in a direction, and by the way, I had a failed startup getting this wrong. So I'll say that I lived this and made this mistake at the biggest level. When you look at the buyer who's trying to cobble together this data, try to create things that are repeatable, things that are scalable, things that, to measure at that level, to start to approach RevOps, you get on a maturity scale. And you just assume whenever there's a scale that it's a bell curve and a bunch of people in the middle and a bunch of people on the right that are, really driving things forward, a couple laggards on the left. And it's just not true.
Okay.
When I take the 10 million people that have channel titles around the world on LinkedIn and you survey them, how do you think, your program's working? How do you think you're managing partners? All these trends going forward, the new buyers and the new systems, and then how do you think you're doing on a scale of 1 to 10? The answer is 3. There's very few people below that. There's very few people above that, but it's not a traditional bell curve. This entire world is at a maturity level 3. We talked about it earlier, kind of the burning fire. And I don't even have the basic things in place to measure my sales. And you're telling me to measure 28 moments. You're telling me to measure every 30 days. You're telling me these hundreds of services need to be multiplied. I don't even have the basic blocking and tackling to run my very basic set of KPIs. So, I back in the day was trying to sell them AI. I was trying to sell them this predictable, prescriptable model and stuff like that. And, while every single one of them thought it was the best thing since sliced bread and it's going to change the world, it always ended with, call me back in 2 years. Right now, I need help with somebody who can get me from a maturity 3 to a 5. Yep. And then someday when I go to a 7, I'll work with you to get to a 9. But, 20, 30 years later, everybody's stuck at a 3.
Yep.
So we need to be solving problems at a maturity level 3 in this industry. And it gets back to what Scott and you've been talking about, is there's very basic things that need to be put in place before we can have an AI conversation, before we can have even a RevOps conversation to help 35,000 vendors in the tech and telco world at least get to the point we can start talking about the next stage.
And on top of that, Jay, they say, call me in 2 years, and then the channel chiefs change 2 years later anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
By the way, my job right now is only 2.7 years. If you look at the channel chief list from this year, so when I, 2 years from now, I'm not even going to be employed there.
So just on that last piece about ecosystems, of the mud map behind you or the islands behind you, we have had more contact from people on the other islands this year alone than we've had historically ever. So you can see they're trying to now work out how to get the operational data to make their PRMs better, to make their marketing campaigns better. So we're getting a lot more interest in partnering within the ecosystem of ISVs as well. And that's unprecedented for this year.
I think I've been telling everybody, all 233 CEOs on there, that you have an integration first buyer. That goes for your buyer too.
Yeah.
The better you work together in the sandbox, and the better you work with their tech stack to go solve these maturity level 4, maturity level 5 problems.
Yep.
They're going to buy you if you integrate better, as opposed to the next feature, function, generative AI feature that you're going to add. Yep. They just need you to work.
Yeah, clever integration will get you from 3 to 5, or maybe a 6, and then innovation will get you from 6 to 10. That's my view. Or as always, Jay, it just goes way too fast, and there's just too much information. But I do want to end it lightheartedly with you made some predictions at the beginning of 2023. Some will have happened, some won't have happened. They will inform your predictions for 2024. The ones that really stuck out to me was number 1, because I didn't understand it. A third of global IT markets will be subscription SaaS and PLG. Why so low? Hopefully you were wrong there. Tech vendors headcount cuts by 9%. I think it was a lot more.
Yeah.
Half the cloud and third of PCs on ARM. That's probably going the right way. IT distribution will enter a period of accelerated disruption. I think they missed it. I think most of them missed it because there's some incredible ones coming. I mean, explain the how well PAX 8 are going. Did they miss the mark and things like that? Fastest growing ever, I believe, and demanding greater efficiency, especially around the sustainability area. Thinking about all that, what worked and what happened. I want to ask you both, Jay first. What is your most critical prediction? The one critical prediction for the channel in 2024?
My prediction is that in 2024, regardless of the macros, the two conflicts in Europe and the Middle East, regardless of interest rates, inflation numbers, global economy, whether we dip into a global recession, my prediction is the channel outgrows vendors once again. Customers are getting to a point, and they did it in security first. And Scott, I think, mentioned the outsourcing number from the 90s. I was at IBM during the time, so I remember when people thought that all of our jobs were going to India.
Yep.
And then repatriated, and then we got to task sourcing. But that topped out at 30%. There was, in the 24 years of managed services, up until 2 or 3 years ago, it topped out at 30% again. I thought as an analyst, it was a magical number that 30% of people outsource some or all of their IT, and 70% of them want to keep control. Security as an industry broke that open. Whether you're the biggest bank, the biggest federal government, you can't do it alone.
Yep.
Without the massive data sets and without the massive MDR, XDR, EDR technologies that all the companies share data, now 82% of companies outsource some or all of their IT. Managed is a $500 billion business. So in this world that customers are outsourcing more and more and more, and we broke that 30% threshold, and we have these multiplier numbers available, I think we're going on a multi-year scheme of where partners outgrow their vendors over and over and over again. And it's great news for distributors. It's great news for vendors themselves, that their partner channel is healthy and outgrowing them.
Yeah, I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with someone, and they didn't believe the outsourcing side of the numbers that I was sprouting. A lot of them were yours, Jay. And I said, how about this? Electricity is part of the whole IT spend, electricity. So 100% is outsourced. Let's start from there. Right. And then you start to look and see what you're putting into the data center. And then you start to look at what you're doing with networking, which I believe is going to be bigger than anything next year. And you start looking at that. It's 100%. So start from there. You've already got the model. How are you going to refine it? 1% maturity to get to 3% maturity solves that problem. And then we keep going from there. Scotty, what's your biggest?
I think the way I see it, the way I've felt the last 6 months with the sort of inquiries and leads that have been coming in and asking the question, why did they, track us down? I think there's a cohort that's now understanding they need to take control of their own install base, not rely on vendors or distributors potentially to feed it. And I think you're going to see that accelerate. So both internally and externally. So you think about some of the large Cisco resellers we run. They bite off a little bit because they're not quite sure what we are, and they'll put 5 or 10 users on, but then very quickly it'll go to 100, 150 users because they feel comfortable with it. Because, it's a new market for them. It's not something traditionally they've done. And so you'll see internal acceleration as well as you'll see more and more of these partnerships come on. We've got, another couple of big distributors coming on. That's going to change the game because now we're going to start plugging the platforms together to make sure the data is right at both levels and people can act appropriately whichever level of the channel stack they are. So I see acceleration and more, especially resellers coming into the fold.
Yeah, both very strong predictions. And again, gents, thank you so much for giving me so much on this one. This is really another masterclass. Jay, you're fantastic. You're perfect, mate. And Scott, you're brilliant. I can't thank you guys enough. It'll maybe, depending on what Ellie, the boss, who is the producer of Channel Talks, that doesn't get enough credit. So shout out to Ellie. Might make me have to do another one or two before the end of the year, but if it isn't, I do want to wish everyone happy holidays, and hopefully next year is going to be one of excitement. Jay, I look forward to seeing you next year and talking more about this. Scotty, as always, thank you for the practical. I am going to, just to my audience, I am going to do a Channel Talks very soon on how to execute on this by talking to a RevOps specialist or a SalesOps specialist. So not the usual kind of people that we have on board, but an exciting guy. But thank you for tuning in. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of year and holiday season. Be safe, be great, and we'll see you guys in the next one. All the best, guys. And thanks, Scott. Thanks, Jay.